Okay, I've been reflecting on what I was discussing in the last recording about time traveling empathy, and I wanted to get into that a little deeper. It's funny, the phrases that we're all exposed to from a young age here, like, don't judge a man until you walk a mile in his shoes, or the golden rule, treat others as you would like to be treated yourself. We hear these things, but of course this is easier said than done when you're in the line of fire, as it were, right? There's no atheists in foxholes. And so when you get thrown into a real life situation and it's all happening so fast, you forget about these little things that you learned when you were a kid. And you don't treat someone very well. And if it were you, you definitely would not want to be subject to whatever you just did or said to someone else. But we forget these things because we're human and life happens, right? We all get caught up in these situations that make us temporarily lose sight of what's important. But anyway, the idea specifically is time travel of the mind, mental time travel. You have feedback loops in your stream of consciousness. You have the feedback loops of memories, and you have the feedback loops of projected possible futures. Obviously, this part of it is a function of your imagination. Anything that you can imagine yourself being or involved with in the future. That would be a part of the projected images that are feeding back into your stream of consciousness over and over again. And simultaneously, you have all of these memories, all those images of things that have happened to you in the past flowing through your stream of consciousness at the same time. And then the present moment is just that moment that you are filtering both of those feedback loops and experiencing the world around you, experiencing everything that happens. I know this is all very abstract, but just think of it like I'm talking right now. This is my present moment. And while I'm talking, I have the feedback loops of memories and the feedback loops of imagined possible futures for myself. They aren't quite running right now when I'm focused on being present in the moment. They're kind of just off in the distance, and I have to actually pull them closer to my present stream of consciousness that is speaking currently to actually see them and feel them. But when you're not focused on communication like this, in any given moment during the day, they can be really present as you're dwelling on something that happened in the past, or you're dwelling on something that could happen in the future. Whether it's something that's planned in the future already, or it's just something you're imagining for yourself. In other words, the idea is it is essentially time travel to go into the feedback loops of the past or into the feedback loops of the future, to move your stream of consciousness back in the past or into the future. And if there has been some sort of physical way to time travel invented, it would be some type of device that channels energy to send someone's consciousness into the future or into the past. And they would inhabit their own body in that process. It would be like waking up inside of yourself in a different time, but all of a sudden you are carrying the awareness of yourself from the future and then reliving these past events. Now, is something like this possible? I don't know. It could just be that any sort of physical depiction like this is just a metaphor for what we can do and what we are capable of experiencing through our minds, our stream of consciousness. I don't know. How could I possibly know if they've invented something like that? Because anytime you get into the idea of time travel, the paradox emerges where whatever happened, happened. So if it's been invented in the future, well, that already happened. And we would already be interacting with it, even if we haven't experienced that yet. But time travel paradoxes aside, let's get into the idea that I wanted to get into, which is the idea of empathy in this context. And like I said in the last recording, empathy is somewhat theoretical in the sense that you're detached from it as an idea. Something bad happens to someone and you have the theoretical response, oh man, that is terrible. I can't believe that happened. I feel so bad for them. What I'm talking about here is a more real version of that, a less than theoretical version where you're actually experiencing your own awareness in the mind of someone else as they go through whatever they're going through. And then you have this lived version of the empathy. You could think of it like putting on a pair of VR goggles, right? And you experience this world in the VR realm that seems very real. I mean, if we imagine they developed the technology to the point where you could not distinguish the VR realm from the real world. You would put on the VR goggles and you're immersed in someone else's field of vision and experiencing whatever they're experiencing. That's sort of what I'm getting at here, transferring your stream of consciousness into the field of awareness of another being, experiencing what they experience. Now, obviously, this is sort of a mental exercise. Are you really doing that, or are you just imagining yourself doing that? Well, that gets into the very nature of reality itself. Am I really experiencing what I'm experiencing right now? Well, sure, but what is the actual process that's going on in my physical body that's creating this illusion of sentience? Again, that's something I can't possibly answer. And it's somewhat irrelevant, right, because I'm having the experience. It doesn't really matter how it's transpiring. Well, I should say it doesn't really matter as it relates to what I'm discussing right now. Of course, it matters in the grander scheme of things. But anyway, so I've been toying with this idea of mental time travel over the years and your stream of consciousness and how it interacts with reality and everything around you. And I began to experiment with it in a different context. At first, you experiment with it and you are just doing it in your own mind. You're going back to memories in the past. Maybe they're traumatic memories, and you have this inability to remove yourself from the trauma, and it's controlling you, whether it's conscious or subconscious in some way. And so you're going back into that memory, immersing yourself in the time period. If it was the 1990s, you're there. You're imagining everything that was going on at that time, and then you're putting yourself into the scene. You're back in your awareness, experiencing everything as it was then, to the best of your recollection. And then you're not absolving anybody who was involved in that trauma completely, but you're recognizing, oh, hey, okay, everyone who was involved in this thing that happened to me that was traumatic, they didn't know fully what they were doing because they weren't aware of the larger control system that exists on this planet, and they weren't aware of how they were being manipulated. And so you let them off the hook in that way to the point where you can try to begin to move beyond the trauma, letting go of it, letting go of everything that's associated with it and attached to you still. Now, obviously, this is easier said than done, depending on what the trauma actually was. Some things are very difficult, especially if it's sexual in nature or something like that, which many people have experienced. And then at that point, it's like, well, I don't even want to put myself back there. And that's an understandable reaction, and I can't really empathize, speaking of that word, with that, because I, to my knowledge, have never experienced something like that. But that's the general idea of the process, and then it's the same for the future. You're sitting there thinking, okay, I'm imagining my body in this healed state. I'm imagining my mind in this healed state. I'm feeling myself in this healed state that I don't quite know what it looks like, but I know what it feels like. I know what it would feel like. And I'm imagining that playing out, being in that state. And I'm just going to carry that with me as it loops through my stream of consciousness. And I'm just going to slowly merge my way into that reality. And obviously going back in the past would be a part of manifesting that in your future, healing the trauma in the past so that you can reach this imagined state in your mind. And naturally, if every individual currently existing on the planet was engaged in this process, well, we would reach the stage where everyone was in a healed state, mentally, physically, and any other way that you can think of. And things would be a lot different here. Now, the problem, of course, is that this idea of manifestation has been polluted with the musings of various New Age charlatans, and you guys all know who I'm referring to when I refer to this, but it's this idea that manifestation is some way to attract wealth, popularity, influence, or anything else that you can associate with being detached from creation, right? That's how it's sold to people, and so they're seeking out these things, these material items, and this material life that is illusory and pulls you away from any sort of real healed state within your very being. And eventually you reach the point where you say, man, these people around me are just never going to get it. I'm just going to worry about myself. And then you're ignoring everything that's going on in the world around you. And you see how this works because those things that are going on around you are depressing and they bring you down if you focus on them. So when you're into this law of attraction mentality, you can't focus on those things that bring you down because it will inhibit your ability to create this reality for yourself. And then it's like, okay, well, what happens when you eventually create this reality for yourself, assuming this process worked? Well, does that mean everything around you just went away, all of the depressing things? No, of course, it's still there, but you've just removed yourself from the situation, and apparently this has no impact on you, right, because you've transcended all of that. You get the idea of what I'm referring to here. And hey, I understand that mentality of, well, they're never going to get it, I'm just going to worry about myself. I totally get that. But I have been experimenting with this idea in a different way, meaning I started to imagine my awareness inside the mind of another being or creature. In this case, I started with a dog. I, from time to time, dog sit my sister's dog. And he's this cute little dog, and he's my little buddy whenever we hang out. And so we were hanging out in the same room, and I started to imagine my awareness inside of the dog's mind. And this is a very simple process because I have the image of the room I'm in around me already. So I have that picture in my mind, but then now I'm inside the dog's mind. And I'm looking at myself in the same way that you would look in a mirror. And I'm on the ground looking up at myself and the room around me, just imagining what it would be like to be an awareness inside of this animal. And this process, I don't know how to describe it, but it's so fascinating. It just completely grounds you, I want to say. It's like a dimensional shift. You're in a certain dimension, viewing the room around you, and now all of a sudden you're in a completely different dimension with a different perception. And you can imagine being inside the dog's mind, looking around, looking up, and I'm huge to the dog, to this little dog, my body, and so you're seeing yourself as much bigger than you actually are, imagining all the little things like this. Imagining me talking to the dog at this point, and it doesn't understand English. It's smart, but it only understands a few words here and there, like it would understand sit. And so you imagine speaking, sit, and then you understand that word, and on it goes, right? You can get really into the weeds with this sort of thing, imagining the scene and the situation. You can imagine yourself walking around in this body where your primary way of navigation is the sense of smell, and you're imagining smelling to get around. And so you see what I mean, how you transfer your consciousness into a different vessel and you have a different perception, a different experience. And this is a good way to get used to what I'm going to get into now, which is actually putting your mind inside of someone else's mind, putting your awareness in their stream of consciousness, imagining what a day in their life is like. And this goes back to the phrase that we all learn when we're kids, right? Well, don't judge a man until you walk a mile in his shoes. Well, this is literally walking a mile in someone else's shoes, imagining what it would be like. And a funny thing happens when you do this, right? You have a completely different perception of them, who they are, and what they've experienced. You know, as much as you can have any sort of information like this, it works better for people that you know really well, that you know a lot about, because you can fill in the details better than you can for a stranger. But it's ironic because it's actually easier to feel empathy for a stranger for that very reason, because you don't know everything about them. So it's much easier to just kind of brush off certain things because it's a stranger and you don't have all those minute details about the person that are clouding your judgment as far as empathizing with them, right? When it's someone you know really well and you know everything about them, when you're empathizing with them, all of a sudden you're thinking of these little things that they did, and then you want to say, oh, well, no, I'm not going to do that anymore. Forget them. So that's ironic that that kind of unfolds in that way, but it really does explain why some of these platitudes and truisms work so well, because you say something like the golden rule, but then when people are actually involved in their everyday life, they just forget about it because they have too much information about the people that they're interacting with. And all of that information is a way for us to hold grudges or hold things against people. And by dwelling on the past in that way, we prevent any sort of healing, because no matter how much someone wants to go back into their mind and then likewise imagine some healed future of themselves, if other people who they are attached to energetically are holding them back from that based on what they believe about them, it's going to create an energetic resistance that's going to kind of stop them from moving on. And they won't even know it, right? They'll just be held back, but they won't understand why it keeps happening. And so that's part of your responsibility as it relates to who you're interacting with and how you're interacting with them. Maybe an example would help elucidate this. So let's imagine that the scene is something that everyone can identify with, which would be a partner. Girlfriend, boyfriend, wife, husband, whatever the case may be. And if you're in some rare situation where you've never had anything like that in your life, just imagine your parents, mom or dad. So you're in the same room with this person and you're having a conversation. And what happens? Well, something that's happened to all of us at some point along the way. Some frivolous argument begins to emerge because we're stupid humans and we worry about silly things. And you know how it goes. Some silly argument begins to manifest itself. And you, knowing a lot of things about this person, you know how to cut them deep, right? And even if it's not your intention to ever hurt somebody, sometimes your pride takes over because you don't want to lose an argument, right? You don't want to give away your power in that way. This is how we're taught to be when we're younger. You know, as we grow older, we're taught to identify with this illusory personality and protect it and be right all the time as much as possible. And pretend like we have everything figured out. And then that manifests when you're in an argument with somebody and you don't want to give much ground away. You want to protect that illusion that you're right and you know what you're talking about. And sometimes, even if your intent would never be to hurt the person that you're having this disagreement with, you just say something in the heat of the moment, right? When you're totally not thinking about anything else other than just being in the heat of this moment, and there's all this energy around the situation, and you say something that you would never say if you were calm, cool, collected, thinking about it. You would never say this thing. But you say it. And so instead of imagining you just saying that and thinking about it and, oh, I shouldn't have said that, well, shift your awareness, shift your stream of consciousness into their body. Look at yourself through their eyes. Imagine the words coming out of your mouth and hitting you. Imagine those sonic sound waves vibrating into your being and the intent that's behind it. And of course, we've all had our feelings hurt before. We know what it feels like to have feelings hurt. And so you're in that other person's eyes, feeling that coming at you, and you feel how it cuts you so deep, and oh, that hurt. I can't believe they said that. And then that just starts, all kinds of other feelings that you're feeling in the moment. And this is what I mean by time traveling empathy, right? It's a function of the same sort of mental time travel process, except you're in the same moment, imagining a scene like that playing out. And this could be a scene that happened in the past, or that's happening right as you do it. It would be hard for it to be a scene that's happening right as you do it because you're so in the moment not thinking about any of this. But that would be the end goal, right? To where every interaction that you're having, you're sort of imagining yourself in the mind of the other person, which really regulates your behavior, and doesn't let you get sucked into everything that this world tries to get you sucked into as it relates to interacting with other people. But so you're there in that person's mind, you feel it, and then you look at yourself and you think, oh my gosh, I would never willingly do this to another person. I would never want someone else to feel like this based on something that I say or do. And speaking of imagined potential futures, I like to toy with the idea of imagining a future where everyone is sort of aware on this kind of level of their actions and how they're interacting with everybody, because we would have a much different environment all around us. And it's easy to see why everything is set up the way it's set up, why the media exists as it does, and why it promotes what it promotes. It's injecting these ideas into the collective feedback loops of the imagined possible futures. And so we become so preoccupied with the images that they're putting into our mind that we imagine hopelessness and despair and everything that comes along with the fear that they implant into our minds if you pay attention to that stuff. If we were all aware on this individual level of the way that those images and feelings interplay with our stream of consciousness in the present moment, we would never fall for things like that. And we would stay focused on the present moment and how we're interacting with everyone, regardless of what the media says or what this person may or may not have done to us in the past. On and on it goes, right? This is the process that I was envisioning when I was considering the man who was sent to prison for 22 years and put on death row, even though he was innocent of the crime they charged him with. And you can see how that is sort of like time travel, because this happened many years in the past. You're putting yourself, your awareness, inside of this guy's head. You're immersing yourself in the time period that it transpired during. And now, I've never been to prison, so I can't imagine, I don't have any foundation to draw from practically for that experience, but I'm doing my best to imagine it. Imagining what it's like to have gone through that whole experience day by day. It's sort of like people who do psychedelics and they come back from the experience and say, oh my gosh, it felt like I was gone for 1,000 years, but it was 15 minutes. When you have an experience like this where you're trying to put your awareness in someone else's stream of consciousness and experience what they were experiencing for 22 years, it's kind of like that. Even though it's only momentary in your mind, if you truly immerse yourself in that situation as best you can, it feels like you were there for 22 years because you're tapping in to the energy that that person left into the morphic field that the collective human race is constantly drawing from, generation to generation. All of that energy leaves a signature that can be tapped into. And in this way, it's like time travel. So you're momentarily there, when you access that memory, you access that energy, but you get the feeling of how long that experience really was and how long it felt when you were immersed in it. And again, we're talking about empathy here. Yeah, there's only so much that you can truly feel based on an energetic signature, as opposed to going through it yourself. I mean, it's never going to exactly replicate it, but that's not the point. The point is to get the idea of what it was really like so that you can understand what someone else went through. And when you truly understand it in that way, I mean, your whole worldview shifts. And then inevitably, as a part of this process, you start to ask the question, why is this happening? Where am I? What is going on? Because you're feeling all of these experiences that are tremendously dystopian, tremendously awful. Why would anyone need to experience this? What is going on? And interestingly, sort of what we're all doing when we're trying to figure out where we really are, what this planet really is, what this experience really is, we're using the same process, right? We're drawing from the feedback loops of the memories and the feedback loops of the imagined futures. It's just, in this instance, we're imagining what this place actually is, trying to get that picture in your mind's eye of where you really are. And it's difficult, right? Because this is the biggest question that there is. Hundreds and hundreds of books written on the subject before electricity existed. And there are traditions all over the world that have their take on it. For example, you could go with the more Eastern take of reincarnation and karma to try and explain why people are experiencing these sorts of things. Well, this guy who was imprisoned wrongly for 22 years, he must have done something in a past life that was horrific, and this is his karma, the penance that must be paid. We're all trying to make sense of why bad things happen to quote-unquote good people. And that's a tough one too, right? Because you don't know how good someone quote-unquote is. That's a very nebulous definition. You can't quite get your hands around that one, good and bad as a human incarnated here. There's so much relativity there based on experience. Again, going right back to walk a mile in their shoes before you judge them. I mean, you just don't even know what someone's been through, and something horrible happens to them and you say, man, this was a good person, but you don't know that. In the same way that you would say, oh, this is a bad person, and you don't know that either. However, that's not to get into the trap of moral relativity. No, there are objective morals here. There are objective right and wrong things that you can do. It's just a little more nuanced than that when it's applied to an individual, right? Alternatively, you could look at a more Western view, which would be based on the Abrahamic religions. And this is best exemplified through the story of Job in the Bible. I'm pretty sure it's Job. You'll have to correct me if I'm wrong about that. But the story of Job is Satan goes to God and says, hey, I'm pretty sure you're wrong about these human beings, and I'm going to prove it to you. And God says, well, okay, fine. You can do whatever you want to Job other than kill him and see if he loses his faith. I'm betting that he doesn't. And Satan says, all right, you got it, God. And so he comes down on Job, does things to Job that the ordinary person would just lose their mind and give up and lose their faith. But as the story goes, Job keeps his faith and then is rewarded by God with more than he ever lost, more than Satan ever took away. You could go with an idea like that. Say, well, this happened to this guy, and things like it happen to people all over the world because they're being tested. They're having their faith tested. Similar idea in the Middle East, ancient Egypt, for example. You enter the Duat, And to get further into the afterlife process, the first thing they do is weigh your heart against a feather. And if your heart is lighter than a feather, then you get to advance. And if not, they kick you out. And this is very similar to the Western idea of heaven and hell. It's just that in the Western idea, your motivation is to do good things in your current life so that you experience this afterlife of heaven, as opposed to the more Eastern view where it's lifetime after lifetime. No, you want to do the right thing in your current lifetime so your next lifetime is a good one. But all of these ideas are trying to explain the fundamental issue of where are we and what is the correct way to perceive this reality so that you don't take a step backwards, however you want to perceive that. All of these ideas are attempting to explain the unfairness that we witness all around us, right? And that's an interesting idea in a situation where there's a control system that has created a slave class. How very interesting that all of these different philosophies exist that all in their own way justify unfairness and deplorable conditions. And so to me, the thing that's always made the most sense is that wherever we are, whatever's going on, the image in my mind that seems the clearest is that this place is suffering from some kind of metaphorical illness. That doesn't make any sense. You can't make sense of a disease, right? In the same way that you can't make sense of cancer in the body. Think about that. It doesn't make any sense for your cells to attack other cells. Your body is this amazing vessel, this amazing machine that is designed to function harmoniously, where each cell has its own job and they work together to produce sentience and life. So it makes no sense that one cell would attack another cell. It doesn't make any sense that cells would take over the body and kill it because they're killing their own ability to live. You see, you can't make sense of cancer in the body. No matter how hard you try, no matter what philosophy you adopted to say, well, you know, one of those cells in your body was a bad cell and it got what it deserved when it got eaten by the other cell, right? No, it doesn't make any sense when you're viewing it from the larger scale of consciousness, which is your sentient perception of the cells in your body. And so you might be able to see how from the sentient perception of a scale higher than us, what's going on here would make no sense and would be viewed like a disease in such a way that there is no philosophy that would be able to make sense of it. And you might envision a situation where all of the philosophies and traditions are just trying to get the cells to not question what's going on, to just keep the status quo continuing of cells eating other cells and being in this environment of disease where nothing makes sense. But that doesn't help you answer the question of, well, where am I and where do we go when this is all done? I mean, that's very difficult to imagine because it's so far beyond the scope of what we're experiencing. But just as an aside, that is an interesting part of all this, right? As it relates to all the different philosophies and traditions and the different languages that are spoken around the world. Well, English is the new world language. Every country, for the most part, now speaks English as a second language if it's not their native language. And so no wonder we're in this situation now where social media is starting to be censored, right? That makes complete sense. They had to allow the information to be freely available at first because they were trying to get the technology assimilated. And that has taken place, right? Everyone has their phone in their hand, they're staring at it, and that's not going away anytime soon. So they succeeded. The technology has been assimilated, and now it's time for the free speech on the internet to go bye-bye. That's a part of the agenda now, and it was so simple, right? We'll use our agents to stage this censorship, and we will eventually remove the ability to talk about certain subjects on the internet. It's just going to take a little bit of time, and we're in the middle of that process right now. But at first, they had to make people want to have this technology, and that's part of how they did it. But in spite of the fact that it's really difficult to imagine where we are and imagine a healed state in this place, what it would look like, nevertheless, I find it very beneficial and useful to try and to imagine that reality in my projected future feedback loop and try to slowly pull my awareness in that direction. And so, I don't know. All of this is very abstract, but hopefully what I said made sense as much as it can make sense. And maybe I'm just deluding myself into these ideas, but what else am I going to do? What else are we supposed to do when faced with the situation that we're faced with here? Hey, if you know the answer to that question, please enlighten me, because otherwise I don't know what else I'm supposed to do. But I'll leave it at that. Later.